What's happening? Back at it again with another 3D printed build. The Christmas special Boba Fett. The link for the STL files will be in the description below. Anyways, let's get into how I crafted this helmet. Enjoy the video. Before I started sanding to get the support off, I used a flathead screwdriver to pick off the stubborn parts that couldn't be sanded down. Then using a 120 sanding grit, I went around the helmet and the other pieces that had leftover support. While I was wearing some gloves and a ventilator mask, I went over each piece with bondo glazing putty. I didn't want to get too much putty stuck on the vent on the back, so I went around the edges instead. After I had bondo all over the helmet, I went back again and covered up certain areas that needed a bit more putty. When everything was ready to be sanded, I used the flathead again to scrape out the putty that was stuck in the minor little details. As I went on to sand, I used a 180 grit and started going over each piece. So much of the bondo dust gets kicked up into the air, so I would highly recommend you doing this in an open area with your ventilator mask on. Once you've got everything sprayed down, you'll be able to move on to the next step that requires filler primer. Using the spray paint is a nice way to cover more of the areas that show layer lines. After 6 hours of drying, I go out each print with 220 sand grit paper. The last method I use to get each print very smooth is called wet sanding. But before I get to the actual sanding part, I use a wet napkin and wipe off as much of the primer dust that's left over. Then as we proceed, on the last part of sanding, I used 1000 grit and I dipped it in a bowl of water. This part of sanding is going to help all your prints feel and look extra smooth. When using the 1000 grit, I dried off the water and continue to rinse and repeat this process around the whole helmet. Moving on to the paint job, I used a flat black to base coat each piece. For the helmet, I sprayed the bottom first, then I placed it on a broom to get the rest of it. Once the black set in for about a day, I moved on to the earpieces and used mirror chrome to get the color I wanted. Using masking tape, I covered the majority of the rangefinder to spray on some chrome. For the cover on the right ear, I used a gold spray paint. Going on to the helmet, I used Oasis Blue starting from the bottom, then all the way around. Once I let the blue dry on the helmet, I masked the cheeks so I can get a different shade of blue in. The paint had bled through the helmet and the rangefinder, so I had to do a little cleanup before I continued forward. Starting with the rangefinder, I mixed together some Gorilla Epoxy to bond pieces together. While those pieces dried on the side, I mixed together some more epoxy and placed the antenna cover on. I set aside the rangefinder so I can work on other pieces like the vent and bonded it to the back. After letting the back vent and the rangefinder dry, I started bonding the earpieces to the helmet. At this point, the helmet was nearly done, but I wanted to add some weathering to it. To get the weather look I wanted, I mixed together some black acrylic paint and isopropyl alcohol. When both were mixed pretty well together, I dipped the sponge into the liquid and started rubbing it across the helmet. After a couple seconds of applying this, I used a wet napkin to take off the liquid. You can rinse and repeat this process until you got the weather look you want. For the dent in Boba's helmet, I added slightly more paint than alcohol. I made the helmet look more dirty than weathered, so I used a wet napkin to take a bit of the weathering off. The last step for this build was cutting out and placing the tinted visor in. Once I had the T-shape cut out, I placed it inside the helmet and lined the edges with epoxy putty. I'd highly recommend epoxy putty on this step just because this stuff dries up pretty fast and works really well with all the helmets I've ever made. And after all that effort, you get the Christmas special Boba frickin' Fett. Honestly, the colors on this one are fucking amazing and they're part of the main reason why I wanted to do this build to begin with. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good freaking morning, evening, night, wherever you're watching from, baby. Peace.